Coming to the Jackson Center.
I'll tell you, on the last oral history thing I was in not long ago at the American Law Institute, my interrogator was one of the elderly members of the council, Phil Anderson, and after 3.5 hours, we only got halfway through his notes.
Well, I probably should have gotten his notes, because mine aren't quite that long. Let's get you started.
Yeah.
Born in 1916?
That's true.
And where?
In New York, New York.
Were you destined to be a lawyer? Is that something that...
Oh, no, I almost was not a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
When I got out of Williams College, along with my roommate Herb Stein, we both went to the University of Chicago to do graduate work in economics. And I fully intended to be an economist. At the end of the following summer, I changed my mind and I decided that I would go to law school.
Now, was your dad, was he into the business world?
My father was a lawyer in New York. He had the extremely good sense never to press me to be a lawyer, even though that's what he thought I ought to be.
Mm-hmm. Though he probably was pleased when you decided that.
I think he probably was, but he had very scrupulously kept his hands off the problem.
So at some point you had a cathartic moment after Williams and decided I might follow a different path.
Well, yeah, I can tell you actually the things that primarily influenced me to change my mind. One was that at that particular time in theoretical economics, the mathematicians were in the ascendancy. And I came to the conclusion that if, in order to be a first-class economist, you had to be a first-class mathematician. I didn't think that was exactly where I was headed. The other thing was that I looked at a bunch of brilliant graduate students in economics at the University of Chicago. This was the year 1935-36, and what was happening to them. The opportunities were not vast. They were being sent off to teach in Midwestern colleges like Knox. I knew I didn't want to do that. Well, how did it come out? A couple of years later, the mathematical economists were at the bottom of the heap. And they were, I guess it took them 30 years to get back toward the top. And within about a year, all kinds of opportunities opened up for economists in the government, in business, in the university, as consultants. So that, I was wrong on both of those points as a matter of prediction. But the thing I wasn't wrong about was my conclusion. I think that my aptitude for the law exceeded what I ever would have had in economics, and my pleasure at being in the law exceeded what I would have found in economics. So I've never complained about the decision I made.
Can I ask about Stein before
Yeah.
we move forward? Was he destined to be an economics superstar from college?
I always thought so. I'll tell you one thing that happened to him very soon after college. He was a pretty impecunious fellow. And that year, I guess the year after we got out, the Pabst Company had an essay contest for on economics. And the first prize was $25,000. Who won it? Herbert Stein.
At that point, he's destined for great.
So that was an indication that he was heading in the right direction.
Right.
Because ultimately, he became the chairman of Nixon's Council of Economic Advisors.
Can I ask you to tell the Ben Stein story about the letter when Herb Stein is retiring? You told me that story a couple years ago.
Yeah. Herb retired from the government really about 3 weeks after Nixon resigned, when Ford had been president for about 3 weeks.
Right.
And there was a big party held for Herb. And Herb said, "Would you and Shirley like to come to the party?" And I said, "Sure." So we got there, and in due course he said, "Would you like to meet the president?" And I said, "Sure." So he said, "Follow me." And we went over, and he introduced me, his roommate, to President Ford. He's my wife, Shirley. And we had a pleasant enough conversation. And then about 10 minutes after that, the gavel struck and everybody was silent, and President Ford was about to speak. And, you know, I was pretty sure that he didn't know Herb very well. I don't mean he didn't know him, but I don't think he had ever worked with him. He had no reason to feel that he knew him well. And he made the most wonderful speech about Herbert Stein that you could imagine. It was friendly, warm, and it talked about Herb's great qualities. I later learned that who had written the speech? Well, Herb's son, Ben, was a speechwriter in the White House at that time. And as a result, that's how the speech came into being.
Oh, to have people in high spots.
It helps.
It helps a lot. So you graduate from Williams. Was Harvard your first choice?
Well, you mean when I finished with my year at the University of Chicago in economics?
That's right.
Well, I'll tell you what happened. I made up my mind to change about August 1. That's pretty late. I wrote to 2 law schools, Harvard and Yale. Yale wrote me back a letter that was very polite. It said that under ordinary circumstances they'd be delighted to have me, but it was a very small class and it was full. Harvard wrote me back and said, come ahead. So I never had to debate this question of which of the 2 great law schools I should go to. I just went.
That's a good answer. While there, certainly there was so many esteemed professors. Were there a couple that stand out in your mind as people who shaped your career?
Well, surely. I got to know Felix Frankfurter reasonably well because, among other things, he was friendly to the editors of the Law Review, and I was on the Law Review. But in addition to that, he had 2 law clerkships at his absolute disposal, the 2 hands in the Second Circuit. And he elected to send me sight unseen to learn in hand. And my friend, who was there doing a year of graduate work, Seymour Rubin, to Augustus hand. In both cases, sight unseen. The judges never saw us till the day we reported for duty. I don't believe that happens anymore. Yeah. Or if it does, it's pretty rare. We were quite friendly with him. He was teaching a seminar in federal jurisdiction for our senior year. In the middle of the year, his nomination to the Supreme Court was announced. Several of us from the Law Review, Phil Graham and I guess Bob Browker and John O'Boyle, went over to the Frankfurters to congratulate him. And there he and his wife Marion were. What were they doing? They were having tea with Alfred North Whitehead and Mrs. Whitehead.
Terrific.
And then when he was about to come to Washington to testify, because the Senate committee had asked him to on his nomination, the same group of us escorted him down to South Station in Boston and put him on the train.
Was there some question about whether he would be confirmed?
I don't think so.
Okay.
A few people were raising a question about whether he was unduly left-wing, which was sort of silly, but
right.
You know, you get that.
Was there any anti-Semitic climate?
Oh, I don't think so.
Okay.
If there was, I don't remember it.
Right. In the other direction, did it have palpable significance for Roosevelt to pick a Jew in 1939?
Oh, I don't think so. After all, Brandeis had served with great distinction on the court.
I mean,
Cardoza had served with great distinction.
Right. Vis-a-vis the world stage,
No.
Hitler.
I don't think that had anything to do with it.
Okay.
Felix was very close to FDR, as you probably know, and advised him on all kinds of things. And
being close on the law review, being close with Professor Frankfurter, knowing that Frankfurter was having this relationship with Roosevelt, did you get caught up in any of that political suggestions, or did they ask for advice from
Not really.
his think tank?
Not really.
Yeah.
And that was a period when the court packing plan was being discussed, as you may dimly recall.
Right.
And no, Frankfurter never came out against it firmly, but I don't think you could find anything that ever indicated that he was for it.
Right. But, so you don't think there was there any suggestion that Roosevelt was conferring with Frankfurter during 1937 when this was sort of...
Oh, I think he always was conferring with Frankfurter about something.
Yeah.
Was there
And
a,
Felix populated Washington with protégés of one kind or another, very good young lawyers.
was there a campus climate at the law school on court packing, pro or con?
I don't remember it. I don't want to say there wasn't, but I certainly don't remember it.
In addition to Professor Frankfurter, were there other notables that shaped you?
Oh yeah, we had a very good faculty, you know. Henry Hart was on the faculty, a very distinguished person whom we got to know very well. I didn't have him really, but Scott was still actively teaching. Warren Seavey was actively teaching. It was a really outstanding faculty. It only had one or two lemons on it.
Right. Tom Powell,
Powell was on it.
did you know him?
I
much?
certainly did. I'll tell you a different kind of a story about him. One day, a few of us were being invited over to Powell's house for a drink or dinner, I forget what, and we walked in, and Powell pointed to an oil portrait over the mantel in the living room, and he said, "You know who that is?" Powell's wife's name was Molly. He said, "That's a portrait of Molly's father's substitute in the Civil War."
That's good. That's good.
But as you probably know, in addition to all of his virtues, Powell had a slight problem with alcohol.
Yes. Was that known? Was that visible to you?
A little bit, you know, I would say a little bit, but it became visible much more at a later dinner, at the annual dinner of the Harvard Law Review Association in Boston, when I happened to be at the same table as Powell, and we had to carry him out after the dinner. He passed out cold.
Did you, when you left Harvard, your assignment, sight unseen, was
In learned hand.
hand.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about him.
What would you like to know?
Well, to this distance for the Jackson archives, there are those who might not know the name that as it's
Well, they probably know the name. They may not know much about him.
exactly. You surely know the name, of course.
I would say that of the two people I've known who were the most fluent writers of the English language, Learned Hand and Bob Jackson are the two.
Mm-hmm.
Learned Hand was just unbelievably fluent, with not unduly highfalutin language, but somewhat elevated language, sometimes a little bit poetic. He came to all cases with an open mind, which was a great thing. He wrote out first drafts of his opinions on yellow pads, which I guess have vanished from the human race by now, except for the one John has. And, but he did. I remember one day he called me in to read to me the bulk of an opinion he had written, and he took this and he read it to me. And I said, "Judge, I think that's all wrong." And he said, "Why?" And we had a long discussion of this. And he said, you know, I agree with you. He took this order opinion, tore it up, threw it in the wastebasket, and started over. Well, I don't know many judges who would do it that way.
Yeah.
They would try to salvage whatever they could of the draft.
Oh, interesting. And you just had one term with him?
Yeah.
One term?
That was his custom.
Okay.
He took one local, with someone normally from the graduating class at Harvard.
In that day, was the Second Circuit just 3 judges?
Oh, no.
No.
We were, I guess, 5 judges. There were 3 in New York, the 2 Hands, and Judge Patterson, who later was killed when he was Assistant Secretary of War in a plane crash outside Newark. And Tom Swan, well, actually, we had 2 people from New Haven. Tom Swan had been Dean of Yale, and then we had Charlie Clerk. It was Charlie Clerk's first year on the bench. And the other judges used to kid him about the federal rules that he had written. And that was the way they pronounced it. Hi.
Raleigh Kidder.
Good to see you. There was another judge, Harry Chase, from Brattleboro, Vermont. And Judge Chase we only saw glimpses of because we would see him when he would come down for the 2 weeks of argument. Then he would vanish up to Vermont. As far as I know, we never met his law clerk because his law clerk was stationed up in Vermont and I think never came down. If he did, he must have done it surreptitiously. And the rest of us were very friendly. The law clerks and the judges, you know, this is long before the days when any circuit judge had more than 1 law clerk.
Right.
And we might be, several of us, we might be in Gus Hand's room someday, shooting the breeze about something.
Now, how recent was the Manton?
Oh, it was very
tragedy?
recent.
Okay.
It was not only very recent, but Manton's appeal from his criminal conviction was argued in the Court of Appeals the term we were there.
Why don't we back up for the camera and for context?
Go ahead.
Who was Martin Manton and
Martin
what am I talking about?
Martin Manton was the Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. And to put it bluntly, he was convicted of accepting bribes in a group of cases where there is no doubt that he had accepted money bribes. And each of the cases where it was proved that he had accepted a bribe, the judges reopened the case and they were re-argued and redecided. And it was maybe not 100% clear to everybody that the court had jurisdiction to do that, but nobody complained. Mm-hmm. Because at that time, there was this funny statute about the end of the term, and where the jurisdiction ceased at the end of the term. But, as I say, all those cases were reopened. One of them was a patent case that Learned Hand had sat in before. And I said, "You're not going to sit in it again, are you?" He said, "Why shouldn't I?" And he did. And he adhered to his former view, although the case came out the other way this time.
Interesting. Did Judge Hand share any reflections with you on Manton and his criminality and what that all amounted to?
Well, the Hands hated Manton, really.
From before?
Yeah. I remember one day Gus said to me, you know, he said, he was talking about somebody else, and he said, "This is like what my cousin used to say about Manton. He used to say, he's like a monkey on a stick. The higher he goes, the more of his ass you see." That's what they thought about Manton. And furthermore, he infuriated them on the day his appeal was argued. He attended the court. See, it was a specially convened court. Clark was the only one on the circuit who had not sat with Manton, so he sat. And then Sutherland, who had retired from the Supreme Court, was brought back, and I forget who, Magruder, I guess, from the First Circuit, was brought in as the third judge. And on the day the appeal was argued, Manton came up to the courtroom on what was called the judge's elevator. There was a separate elevator in the Foley Square for the judges. And when the hands heard about that, they just were fit to be tied.
Did you see Jackson argue during your time clerking for Hand in the Second Circuit?
No.
Okay.
I doubt that he argued any case that year in the Second Circuit, but maybe he did.
Right.
I attended some arguments for various reasons, either because of who was arguing or the peculiarity of the case, or because we had a patent case in which nobody could figure out how the damn thing worked. But there were all kinds of reasons why we might attend an oral argument, or the judge might say, you might be interested in this one, why don't you come and listen? But we didn't regularly attend the oral arguments. And I don't remember the Attorney General of the United States ever coming, or the Solicitor General.
He would have been SG.
He would have been
fall,
SG then.
And then Attorney General in the winter.
Yeah, but I don't remember his appearing.
Okay.
Your next step is Supreme Court Clerk, Justice Stanley Reed.
Yeah?
How did that happen?
Well, I'll tell you how I think it happened. His law clerk the year before me was Phil Graham. Phil Graham was a classmate and very close friend of mine. He had been president of the Harvard Law Review our year. I was book review editor. And he was Reed's law clerk. Among other things, I think he told Reed that he ought to get me. But in addition to that, I'm sure Felix put his 2 cents in and told Reed the same thing.
Did you know much about Justice Reed when you walk in the first day?
I didn't walk in the first day because Justice Reed was more cautious. He had me come down to Washington to interview me one day during spring vacation. And I came down, and I remembered I stayed overnight at a house that was known as Hockley, which you've probably never heard of, but it had a bunch of young whippersnapper lawyers in it. And I remember the night at dinner, Joe Alsop was there as a guest at dinner that night. And I don't know if you ever saw or heard Joe Alsop, but he was a monologuist. He took over the dinner and he talked through the entire dinner, almost as bad as Arthur Goldberg could have been. But
who was living in the house?
well, I guess that year Pritchard was living in there because Pritchard weighed about over 300 pounds then. I remember in the middle of the night, I heard a big crack, and it turned out the slats on the bed Pritchard was in were broken. But he was living there. Who else was living there? Graham Clayer probably was living there that year. I don't know, people sort of moved in and out.
Right. Was Dave Ginsburg part of that
No,
group? No.
he was part of other groups, but not that group.
Okay.
Chief Justice at that time was
Hughes.
Hughes. Your impressions of Chief Justice Hughes?
Well, now let's finish with the interview
Okay.
with Reed.
I'm sorry.
Well, the
interviews that you-
Reed was nice enough to interview me. He found nothing objectionable, and he said, "Come ahead." That's all there was to it. But
This was in the nature of a double check rather
Well,
than a derby.
I think he didn't want to be in the position of taking on a law clerk he had never seen. I don't blame him for that.
Right.
So you walk in, and there are the Chief Justice is Charles Evans Hughes. Again, what was your impression as you walk in to see a court which you've obviously read about? Had you had any reason to go to the Supreme Court prior to your appearance as a law clerk? Had you visited and
Well,
seen
I'll
arguments?
tell you, in the summer of 1928, my father took me to Washington in the Easter vacation. And at that time, the Supreme Court met in the old Capitol. And we did visit the court. That was the only prior viewing I ever had of the court. I remember what Holmes looked like with his great whiskers, but I had no other impression.
Yeah.
No, I was introduced to the parking space that even the law clerks could park in the court's garage. In those days, it was before the multiplicity of the law clerks and the expansion of the court staff, so that they had to park people a block and a half away.
Right. Chief Justice Hughes, then, he'd be whiskered. I mean, he's an older guy at this point, right?
Yes. You want to know if I ever met him?
Well, you met him, but what your impressions were?
Well, I'll tell you when I met him. I'm a lot later than you think. Because Hughes was very busy, and he was very careful with his time. Mm-hmm. And he didn't really meet any law clerk except his own. He just didn't have time for such things. And I think it was early in January, one day I went down to our apartment desk to pick up the mail, and Shirley said, "Is there any mail?" And I said, "Yeah, there's an invitation from the White House." And she said, "Don't be silly." And I said, "I'm not being silly. This is an invitation to the reception for the judiciary, and apparently all the law clerks have been invited." And so, of course, we were going to go. And I assumed that in order to go to a formal reception at the White House, you needed to come in tails. So I rented tails. I bought a white tie. I thought that didn't cost very much. I never used it again, and I've never had tails on again. And when I got to the White House, a third of the men were wearing tuxedos. So, but in any event, at some point along the line, Justice Reed said, "Would you like to meet the Chief Justice?" And I said, "Of course we would." And he said, "Well, you and Shirley follow me." And so we did, and he took us over to the Chief Justice. This was after everybody had finished shaking hands with Roosevelt, because he sat through the whole reception line. Mm-hmm. But he took me over and he said, "Chief, I'd like to introduce to you my law clerk, Bennett Boskey, and his wife, Shirley." The Chief Justice was very kind in accepting the introduction. And then Hughes said, in substance, "You know," he said, "it's a great opportunity for a young man who's just at the beginning of his legal career to be able to be a law clerk at the Supreme Court." He said, "I wish that when I was a young man, I had had such an opportunity." My wife Shirley looked him square in the eye and said, "Think how far you might have gone." And I started to fall through the floor, but fortunately Hughes laughed. That's the only time I ever met Hughes.
No kidding. Wow.
But toward the end of the term, of course, he announced that he was retiring. And that created the problem of who the new Chief Justice would be. And there's a great deal of speculation about it. And one day Felix said to me, "The president is going to nominate Stone to be the Chief Justice. And Stone thinks that the Chief Justice ought to have two law clerks, not one, and that the senior one ought to be somebody who's been around the court and who knows how the court works." And I believe Stone was then, as an associate justice, he always worked up at his house, never around the court. So I'd never met Stone. Felix said, "I think you'll be getting a call to come up and see him." In about a day or two, of course, I did get such a call, and I went up to his house at 24th and Wyoming and met him, and we introduced ourselves and had a little pleasantry. And then he said to me, he said, "I think that the new Chief Justice, whoever he might be, ought to have two law clerks." and that the senior one ought to be somebody who knows how the court works. And I wonder whether you'd be willing to stay on to take that position. And I said, well, Justice Stone, I've already taken a job with Oscar Cox at the Lend-Lease Administration, I said, but I think that I could honorably get out of that. But I said, how do I know? I was a mean fellow. I said, how do I know that the new Chief Justice, whoever he might be, would want me to be his senior law clerk? Stone said, I think I can give you assurances on that point. I said, under those circumstances, I'd be glad to stay. So that's how I became the non-Columbia Stone law clerk. He had already hired a very nice guy named Roger Nelson as his, what he had thought was going to be his law clerk as Associate Justice.
How much in advance of the public announcement was this hiring conversation?
Might have been a week or two.
Okay.
Was there speculation as to, I know Jackson's name was tossed around as a potential. Did you get a sense of that at all?
Well, no, and the real time that he might have been made Chief Justice more likely would have been the next time around when Vincent became chief. And if we're to believe what has been said, Truman might have named him Chief Justice if he hadn't had that outburst from Nuremberg and caused a spat in the court. But who knows? I don't know what conclusion John has come to.
They're developing.
It's developing. Along those same lines, just as far as characters on the court, your time as a law clerk overlapped with Mick Reynolds.
The first year that I was with Reed, McReynolds left the bench in the middle of the year. McReynolds was only there half a year when I could know anything about him. It's my belief that during that half year, he had 4 successive law clerks. I don't believe the rest of us ever met any of them. We understood he fired one for smoking. I don't know what happened to the others, but he was just a holy terror in some ways. The court had a barber shop. There was a very nice man named Marcellus A. Gates, who was the barber. And when McReynolds went down to get his haircut, he would get just furious if anybody else opened the door to the barber shop. So Gates was very smart. He said to Albert, who was one of the 63-year-old messengers, Albert, you stand outside the door and don't let anybody open it. And that worked. Now, McReynolds had done one other interesting thing. You know, if you've been in the court, you know there are sort of big purple drapes inside the court. McReynolds had said they hurt his eyes. And in order to deal with him, the court directed the marshal to put up some white drapes over them, sheet-like drapes. And I'm sorry, you want to put this?
Just let it drop.
Okay. And they were there the half-term that McReynolds was on the bench, that I was there. But the day McReynolds announced he was retiring, Al Dunham, who was then that year Stone's law clerk, said that Stone's first words were, now they can take down those goddamn sheets.
Well, it sounds like he wasn't very well liked.
He was not very well liked.
You mentioned the barber. And I don't know where I read it. May have been something that you
The
wrote.
barber shop has now been abolished.
Yeah, but
Recently.
Yeah.
I think in your article at the Open Barber, you talked about.
I mentioned it.
Yeah, tell it for the camera. How did some of the either the Supreme Court justices or the law clerks sort of use the barber maybe to move information?
Oh no.
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 No, the barber was a wise man, but it had nothing to do with the court's
Okay.
business opinions. We all liked Gates, And I think he liked us.
So now you become, we're now, I guess, with chronology.
Let's review some of the other members of that court. And I guess this is both your Reed year and then your 2 years with Stone. Owen Roberts. What was your take on experiences with Roberts?
Well, he became a very close friend of Felix, as you probably know. Roberts's law clerk was the one who was different from all the rest of us. He was a permanent law clerk, a fellow named Al Schneider, and he was the husband of Roberts's secretary, and Roberts had brought both of them down from Pennsylvania. So he was not a rotating law clerk, and as a result, I always thought, I never knew exactly what his function was, but as a result, we all felt his function was somewhat different from ours. And we were friendly, but we didn't eat with him nearly as much, and we certainly didn't talk about cases with him nearly as much. Roberts was an interesting fellow. He was, I always thought, reasonably smart and forthright. Well, I'll give you one unpublished anecdote. One of the important cases that came up early in the term was the question of the navigability of the New River. It had to do with what was the jurisdiction of the Federal Power Commission. And it was a very important case, and it was assigned to Reed to do the opinion, and the court split, I forget what the vote was, it was probably 6-3. Two courts below it held the river was not navigable. And the Supreme Court voted to overturn those findings on the ground that the test of navigability was somewhat different from what the courts below thought it was. And the New River really was a tough river, and some times of the year it was hard to find the water. I don't know if you've ever been down in that part of the country, but it's tough river, rocky, etc. And during the Civil War, it had a lot of barge traffic. Roberts, I think, wrote a dissent in the case, saying that the two courts below were correct. Reed wrote the opinion. I've written a little article for the Supreme Court Historical Society's quarterly and about Reed working on that case and how he worked. But I was told later by one of his colleagues that Robert had said that there was a new test of navigability. If it flushes, it's navigable.
The New River is a place where they do whitewater canoe trips and raft trips.
When there's a lot of water flowing,
Yeah.
you can't always get through it on a canoe.
Was Robert someone who was perceived as a potential politician?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
You mean, was he looking to run for office like Justice McLean always does?
Yes.
Or like some people thought Bill Douglas was?
Right.
No, not at all.
Okay.
And Roberts, when he left the court, as you may recall, became the dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School for a while. And when I was, after the war, when I was on the Atomic Energy Commission, we had a problem about a group of people, mainly at Los Alamos, whose clearances were being re-examined, security clearances. And we had to set up a special board to scrutinize these cases. And we convinced Roberts that he should sit on that board. And I remember I was the only one in the commission who knew Roberts, so I went down and met him at the station.
Willis Van Devanter.
It was before my time.
Was gone.
He was gone. Of course, everybody who knew him said that at conferences he was great, even though he was very slow in getting out opinions, and as a result, got out fewer opinions than almost any of his brethren. But he was a great expert on things, and everyone from Brandeis on down said that he was a tremendous help at conference.
Okay. Sutherland, also gone.
Yep, sure.
Okay.
Black.
I don't want to get to them yet.
Yeah.
Cardozo,
He was deceased.
deceased. Any proximate memories that are
No,
special that people shared with you? Okay.
no. I'll tell you one small story that Felix once told me, that Felix's wife Marion was driving Cardozo around Washington, and from one place to another, and they almost had an accident. And Cardozo looked at her and said, "I would give you judgment on that."
Brandeis,
Well, Brandeis was retired,
right?
but I've written a small article about Brandeis
Right.
for the Green Bag,
I
as
read
you
that.
probably remember.
It's lovely, but I'd like you to
But
tell us that much
yeah,
and more.
well, I was told that if I behaved myself as a law clerk, we would get invited to Brandeis's house for tea someday on a Sunday. And sure enough, as the term wasn't too old, we got invited, and we went. And one of the things that happened was extraordinary. As we came, there were not that many people there, but all the men were ushered into one room, and all the women were ushered into another room. And the only movement that occurred during the whole tea was that someplace around the middle, the Justice and Mrs. Brandeis changed rooms. But otherwise, there was utter segregation of the sexes for this tea. And two of the other men I remember very well who were at the tea. One was a man named Sumner T. Pike, who was then on the Securities and Exchange Commission. He was kind of a Maine, what I call a Maine New Deal Republican Yankee, if you can imagine that kind of phenomenon. But later he became a great friend of mine because he was on the first Atomic Energy Commission when I worked there. The other fella I remember being there was a terribly obscure United States Senator named Harry S. Truman.
The Roosevelt appointees. Hugo Black.
What about him?
What's your exposure to him as a Reed clerk?
As a Reed clerk, well, I got to know him because I knew his law clerk and because he was generally hospitable to other justices' law clerks. See, nowadays, you've got every justice entitled to 4 law clerks. In those days, every justice had 1 law clerk until we got to this stone business with 2. So the court was a much more intimate place than it has since become, I think. And it was not unlikely that a law clerk of X would get to know Justice Y. So not intimately, but in a friendly kind of way. And I wouldn't say, for God's sakes, get out of my chambers, I'm busy.
And you would be in Black's chambers?
I was there from time to time.
Would the justices be in each other's chambers?
From time to time.
Okay.
Sure.
Just in seniority, Reed is the next of the Roosevelt appointees. How did Reed work? How did he use you as a law clerk?
Well, Reed worked very hard. And he didn't write easily, as I've been willing to say at print. So that if you attacked his paragraph that he'd written out on a yellow pad, he would try to save as much of it as he could. He would not disagree that some of it ought to be changed, but to the extent that he could cannibalize it and save some, he would try to save it. But he was a great one to work for, because although he wasn't a brilliant man, he had astonishingly good judgment. And he was so nice to his law clerks, and this lasted all through his life. He gave them much more credit than they deserved. He was nice to them. He was always interested in what they were doing, which isn't so unusual, but he was appreciative of what they did with him.
Was he a particularly extroverted personality, or?
Well, I think he had been that before he got on the court, and he found that there was a little more isolation as a judge than maybe he had bargained on.
Okay.
That happens to a lot of people.
Right. Okay. Bill Douglas, as a reed clerk, I guess, and then we're going to turn to Stone, but as a reed clerk, what was your...
Well, I got to know him a little bit, but not a great deal as a reed clerk.
Okay.
He, I don't know whether you know this, but maybe you do. About half of his law clerks disliked him cordially. I think I've given you a good division that would come to about half. And he just didn't treat them in the way they thought they ought to be treated.
And other justices, law clerks, how did he treat them?
Well, he didn't have much to do with them, really.
Okay.
When I was Stone's law clerk, it was a little bit different, because every now and then Stone would send me on a mission.
Right.
And Douglas would get the hint. And Douglas was very friendly to Stone. Stone had befriended him when he went to Columbia Law School, and he was absolutely broke. Stone saw to it that he got through Columbia Law School. So he felt very warm toward Stone personally. Douglas was in many respects, as you probably know, a cold fish.
Before we leave the Hughes court,
Yeah.
Jackson during that term becomes no, he is
No, he isn't.
he is Attorney General.
Yeah, he isn't on the court.
Right. I don't know that he argued anything that term. Do you remember seeing him argue?
No, but I probably did. I remember listening to Biddle, who was the SG, I guess, at the time. No, Biddle may have been Attorney General at the time of the New River case, and I think Biddle argued that case.
Okay.
I may be mistaken.
Okay.
But I remember some great big map they had in the courtroom, and I think Biddle was I think it was Biddle who was pointing to it.
Was there much of a Reed-Jackson relationship during the time you were a Reed clerk?
If there was, I don't remember it. I don't want to say there wasn't.
Okay.
I mean, they obviously knew each other.
Right.
They'd both been in the Roosevelt administration.
Right. Jackson actually had hosted the Reeds here in Jamestown one summer, a few years earlier. They played golf up the road,
Yeah.
which may have been Reed's game. It really wasn't Jackson's.
Reed played golf.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So
A time comes where Justice Jackson's appointed by President Roosevelt. You were a clerk for Justice Reed at the time. What was the impression? What was the buzz among the clerks saying, gee, there's this guy Jackson who's coming over from Attorney General?
Well, no, I think that by the time he took his seat, I was Stone's law clerk, I think.
right. Well, he and Stone are announced the same day.
Right.
But he is
I
the
was not-
successor to Stone's seat.
Yeah. But I was not Reed's law clerk.
Okay. But was there a buzz at all? Any conversation as to...
60 years later, who is to say? I don't remember.
Jackson comes on the court and he has a clerk.
He did. He brought a fella from the Justice Department named John Costello. And John Costello had been in the class after me at Harvard. He was on the law review. I know him reasonably well, which is probably how those 2 years I got to know a little bit more about Jackson than I otherwise would have. And what Jackson was doing. I don't mean John told me anything he should have, but at least it was a friendly operation.
What did you learn?
Not much. I learned that he was a very quick writer, that he wrote very well. He had a wonderful style, I thought. The custom then, I don't know if it's still true today, the custom then was that a new justice, when he came on the court, in the first conference on argued cases, could pick his own opinion to write in a case that he was in the majority. And my recollection is that Jackson picked that silly New York bond case, railroad bond case that involved $125 or whatever it was as a test case. And it was a divided court. It was a very obscure point that was involved under the statute. And I think in the course of writing the opinion and Stone writing a dissent, I think Jackson managed to lose a vote. I think Burns originally voted with him and ended up voting with Stone. I think. Is that right?
I don't know about Burns switching.
Yeah.
You're right about the case. I've recently been going through bureaucratic files. There's a lot of correspondence from the Jackson chambers to the Stone chambers, but it's really to you about recusals. Jackson, having come from the Justice Department, is having to look at each list and say,
Yeah.
I'm out, I'm out, I'm
Yeah.
out. And his notes mentioning you get increasingly familiar.
I didn't know that. But
And he's really writing his notes to Costello,
Yeah.
but he's beginning saying, for Mr. Boskey,
I
and then he
see.
says for Boskey,
I see.
and then he says for Boz.
That's news to me.
So do you remember getting
No.
acquainted with him?
Well, a little bit, but I don't remember the process.
Okay.
He was always very friendly,
Okay.
and I always had a very high opinion of him.
Tell us a little more about Costello. What was he like?
Well, for one thing, he was a good lawyer. He was a little handicapped because he was quite hard of hearing.
He wore a hearing aid?
I think that by his second year as a law clerk, I think he did.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Toward the end of his life, which was much later, he was I was told he was sort of a mess. I don't know much about him. But he served Jackson well those 2 years, I'm sure. He certainly was smart enough. And Jackson didn't need somebody to polish his style. He needed somebody to deflect him from error,
Okay.
if there was any.
Do you know if John had actually worked with Jackson at Justice?
I think he had. I don't know how much.
Okay. Okay. Was it unusual for a clerk to stay 2 terms, as John did with Jackson?
A little bit, but not absolutely unheard of.
Okay. Jackson
Like,
actually wanted him to stay a 3rd term,
Did he?
at which point John said,
See, I had the same problem with Stone.
right, that's why I mentioned it. It reminded me.
During that, do you get a sense when the first year Jackson's on the court, and this would be your first year with Stone, as to how the conferences would work and how you in turn would get information as to how the cases were coming out? Did Stone immediately come back and talk to you as...
Well, I'll tell you what happened, and I may cover this tomorrow a little bit. After the conference, Stone would call me in, and he'd go over what happened, and he would discuss with me the assignments. Now, I don't know whether any other Chief Justice ever did that with anybody, but we would go over it, and I wouldn't interpose too many thoughts on the subject, but occasionally I had one, and I expressed it, and occasionally he thought it was a good idea. So that, I knew immediately after the conference what the votes had been, and which cases were up to Stone to assign, and where he had been in dissent. So it wouldn't be for him to assign.
How quickly would he assign?
He would try to get it out that night.
Okay.
Now, it didn't always work. Maybe it would get out the next day, but it was treated as a matter of high priority.
And what were the factors? Was it backlog? Was it...
Oh, there are tremendous factors. Leaving out the Barnett case, because I'll talk about that tomorrow.
Okay.
There are all kinds of factors. One, which is relevant to Barnett, is being sure you hold your majority together. Not making an assignment to somebody who's going to write an outlandish opinion that'll deflect some of the majority. Another has to do with expertise on the court. Some things are easy for some people and hard for others. Another has to do with backlog.
Were conferences held on Saturdays?
Yes, they were still doing it on Saturdays and later shifted to Friday, as I recall.
So the assignments would not have been done during the conference?
Oh no,
Afterwards.
By memorandum.
There's a little a pad of assignment sheets, and had each justice's name on it, and he would ink in the number of the case assigned.
Okay. And sometimes you would persuade Stone that one assignment might be a better idea than
Well,
another.
persuade is the wrong word. We would discuss.
Would he also share with you the votes?
Oh yes,
So you would know the...
yeah.
During...
Well, I'll give you one example.
You're killing me with it, because we're muzzled a little bit with Barnett here, but that's okay.
I'll give you one example that doesn't come up very often. There was one case, a criminal case, that had been assigned to Felix to write the opinion and for the court, and nothing happened. The opinion didn't come around, and criminal cases, when possible, are supposed to get a priority, and weeks went by and nothing more happened. And I inquired of Felix's law clerk what the hell was going on. Nothing was going on. Other things kept getting in the way. And I said to Stone, I have a suggestion to you as to how you handle this. And he said, what's that? And I said, don't assign any new opinion to Felix. And I'll tell his law clerk why. That produced the opinion.
That's great. Now, Stone is obviously in Washington to interview you, hire you.
Yeah. He lived at
nominated.
He lived at 24th in Wyoming.
Right.
In a
He
great
then-
big brick house.
Okay. He then left Washington. He's in Colorado by the time he's confirmed and takes the oath out there. He's on
I forget.
a Western trip that then returns to...
Yeah, that was that the year he went west instead of to Idaho? I guess so.
Yeah, well, I think he ends up in Vermont. I think he...
New Hampshire.
or New Hampshire. Do you remember sending him mail bags full of briefs and cert memos? And
Well, they went to everybody during the summer.
okay, there's some wonderful letters from him to you about tying them more securely
Oh,
so
well,
they won't burst open.
Yeah, but see, we had that special term, an ex parte querin, in July after the first year I was his law clerk,
Right.
and the court issued a per curiam decision, and said the opinion would be issued later, and that he assigned the opinion to himself, and then he was up at Idaho, or at Peckett's, I guess, that summer.
Peckett's,
New Hampshire. And so we were continually exchanging memoranda on all kinds of things, which later Mason read, partly misread. I think Stone wanted me to stay a third year. And, well, I'll finish the story as long as I started it. He said to me he thought that he would be justified in requesting that I be deferred from military service for a year to stay on with him for another year. And I said to him that I felt very flattered that he felt that way, but that I felt it would be immoral of me me to allow him to do it, and I wasn't going to allow him to do it. Or I would have been there another year.
You had noted that Owen Roberts had sort of a permanent law clerk.
Yeah, Al Schneider.
Yeah. Was there a discussion among the justices that perhaps that was inappropriate, or?
No, every justice was a free agent to do whatever he pleased. And that's what he pleased. Nobody ever questioned it. Later on, Murphy had Gene Gressman for, I forget whether Gene was with him for either 4 or 5 years.
If it had been peacetime, you might well have stayed with Stone for a third year?
I don't think so.
No.
I don't know the answer.
Right.
It was irrelevant. I never had to consider it.
Okay.
I might have. We really got along extremely well. And after a little while, I got to know what he wanted, and he understood that I knew that. And I would not be afraid to write a one-sentence cert memorandum in a non-conflict patent case where the patent case had been held invalid and not infringed.
Did he work entirely at home, or did he use his chambers?
Well, when he became Chief Justice, he then divided himself.
Okay.
But before that, he never used the office at the court that was allotted to him.
Right.
His law clerk, on the other hand, divided his time so that the other law clerks all would get to know his law clerk. In the year that I was with Reed, it was Al Dunham. And Stone had a huge library built on his house. And in order to get in and out of it, you opened a bookcase that moved. It moved. And then his law clerk was sort of up on a balcony over at the end of the room.
Somewhere I've seen a photograph, maybe.
Not of me. I never was on that balcony.
It's a double deck library.
Yeah, and that's at the end of the room,
Right.
sort of above where his secretary was, Miss Jenkins.
Okay. Okay.
I'm going to segue into something here which I'm very interested about. You wrote in an article in the Practical Litigator, and there have been very rare cases calling for lightning speed, in which the court found it practicable to respond. I was reminded particularly of the saboteurs case, ex parte Quirin. I remember this well because it arose in the summer of 1942 when I was senior law clerk to Chief Justice Stone, who was away at Peckett's in Sugar Hill, New Hampshire. The Chief Justice let me know that a special session of the court was about to be convened to deal with the captured German saboteurs' claim that their trial before the Military Commission, which President Roosevelt had constituted on July 2nd, was unconstitutional and otherwise illegal. The court convened on July 29th in what was then called a special term. That's the scene you set in the article. Give us kind of a verbal overview of the buzz that was going on in Washington at this time concerning this really special proceeding.
Well, first, a lot of interesting things happened. One was that Stone's son, Lawson, who was an officer in the Army, had been designated one of the military officers to be counsel to the saboteurs. So the question came up whether Stone should sit in the case. And that was one question. I'll come back to it. The question came up of the court being sure that the saboteurs' counsel in the court was competent counsel. And Kenneth Royal was appointed, who later was Secretary of War. And I listened to that argument for the 2 days it was argued. Kenneth Royal couldn't have argued it better for his side. I thought he was, considering his small familiarity with it and how quickly it had come up, I thought he did an excellent job. And nobody could say that these people didn't have the benefit of competent counsel. Coming back to Stone's participation, His son Lawson had no connection with the effort to file petitions for habeas corpus in the courts. He wasn't connected with it, and he wouldn't. And counsel for both sides in open court, both the Attorney General and Colonel Royal, urged Stone to sit. And this is in the court's journal. And Stone therefore sat.
Justice Murphy had recused himself.
He certainly had.
Okay. And the reason?
The reason? Well, he had gotten himself activated as a lieutenant colonel in the reserve, and his picture had appeared on the front page of the New York Times on his belly behind a machine gun. He had done all this without consulting anybody on the court, and it was obviously inappropriate for him to sit, and even Murphy knew that.
Is it true that he showed up in uniform on the day of the argument, intending to sit, and had to be persuaded?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't know that it wasn't, but I don't think so.
Tell me a little bit about what you listened to the arguments.
Yeah.
Then clearly that was the case of the special term.
The court considered it and issued a per curiam relatively quickly, and 6 of the 8 people were executed.
Did Stone have, after the conference, there was a conference, and did Stone talk to you at all about this?
Yeah, we circulated a per curiam. There was a sentence in it Bill Douglas didn't like, as I recall, and we took it out. And the per curiam was issued unanimously.
Was the expectation that the execution was imminent no matter what the court did?
Well, it was imminent unless the court stopped it.
Well, I guess I'm asking whether...
You're asking whether the president would have
whether the president
defied
was expected to obey.
Who knows? I mean, I realize that you can dig up something in which the president allegedly said to Biddle or whatever that he didn't care what the court... I'm not questioning that he might have said that.
Right.
I don't believe he would have done it, but who knows?
On the court side, well, in Stone's chambers, was that topic discussed, the prospect of executive disobedience?
I would have to say that at a distance of 60-some-odd years, I haven't the slightest recollection.
Okay.
Then the per curiam is rendered, and then the hard part of a decision, or not a decision, but
An opinion, as distinct from a decision.
Yeah, thank
The
you.
decision had been made.
That's right. Decision been made, clearly opinion, and now the rationalization for the decision.
Yep.
You were involved in all that. I mean,
Yes, I was. And the inside history of it has been published by Mr. Mason, who wrote the biography of Stone, and before the biography was finished, published a chapter on that episode in the Harvard Law Review. And in something else I've written for the Supreme Court Historical Society's Quarterly, I described my relations with Mr. Mason on that matter.
I think you're in the Practical Litigator, you're quoted as saying, I previously commented rather disapprovingly on the fact that Mr. Mason disclosed these internal documents.
Yeah, that's true. But that was a special case. 4 of the justices who had participated in that decision were still sitting on the court.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the question, when, even assuming that history has its claims, the question is, when does it have its claims?
Right.
I thought it was too soon.
Didn't the Stone family give Mason carte blanche to publish?
The Stone family put no restriction on Mason.
So it was a matter of his judgment.
It was a matter of his judgment.
Okay. Did he ever respond to you or other critics?
Yes.
And what was his...
I know what he said. he said he had gone around to several justices of the court to ask them whether they had any objection. That Black had said he had no objection. That Felix had said that there was a very heavy responsibility for a biographer to decide a matter like this. And he thought Felix was giving him a green light, and Felix thought he was giving him a red light. I later found out from Felix.
Okay.
He got some ambiguous answers that he thought were okays from, I think, Douglas and Reed.
Was that limited to Quirin, or was that more generally
No,
the book?
No, Quirin.
Oh, okay.
And as you know, the Harvard Law Review published it without checking with anybody else on the assumption that Mason had done all the clearances that were required.
Right. As long as we're on Mason, what's your view of his Stone book overall?
It's a terribly interesting book.
It is.
And one reason is that he had access to the letters that Stone wrote weekly to his two sons about what was going on in the court. Now, a little too much, I think Mason takes everything in those letters at absolute face value on the assumption that the only view about what was going on would be whatever Stone said. And I think sometimes that probably isn't a fair thing to do. But that's what helps make the book very interesting, is access to the papers.
Right.
What do I really think of Mason? Not much.
Okay. Did you have a continuing relationship with him after the biography?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
But Warner Gardner had some relationship with him also.
Okay. Friendly, critical?
Very critical.
Very critical, okay.
You were in association with Warner Gardner from private practice.
Well, that's an exaggeration. Warner and I have been close friends for many decades. When my small law firm broke up about 7 or 8 years ago, I went to Warner and I said my first choice would be to become a subtenant of Shea and Gardner, if you would have me. And Warner said, well, let me see. And a couple of weeks later, he got back and said the first question was whether we have space. He said, it turns out we do have space. So he said, that's one roadblock disposed of. Next question is whether we want you to be our subtenant. He said, I'll find out and tell you. In a couple of weeks, came back and said, we'd be glad to have you as a subtenant. So I became a subtenant of Shea and Gardner, which I still am, except they're no longer Shea and Gardner. They merged with this great Boston firm.
You were a subtenant in the indistinguishable from everybody else in the office.
No, I was very, very distinguishable.
Oh, okay.
No.
Okay.
I paid what was called rent,
Right.
and I had my own equipment, and I had my own employees.
But was it physically separated space, or were you
No, I was...
in the mix?
Yeah, I was on the 6th floor there.
Right.
I'm on the 6th floor of the new building,
Okay, that's what I meant.
which they are now Goodwin and Proctor.
Right.
And in a way, I sort of became Warner's literary promoter. Warner had some unpublished things that I thought should be published. And he gave them to me to do with them what I thought was right. And I got 2 of his articles published in the Supreme Court Historical Society's Quarterly. And I got 1 of his chapters of his little book published, 2 chapters, preface and 1 chapter, published in the green bag. And if you're patient for another week and a half, you'll see another chapter published in the next issue of the green bag.
That's great. What about the Green Bag Press publishing the whole book?
There's no point in that. I think we'll now have published the best parts of that book.
Okay.
This is the chapter on the Solicitor General's office,
Okay.
where Warner was for 6 years,
Right.
under 4 different SGs.
Right.
And it has some hilarious footnotes, I think,
Yeah. Well, it's got the John.
including one about Mason.
I don't remember that one. I
No.
remember the John Frank.
Yeah, well, you have to know more about that situation than Warner put in. You have to know that Charlie Fahey was a very religious Catholic,
Yes.
and that isn't in the face of the footnote.
No, but with that,
If you
knowledge,
know
the
that,
footnote makes
then
sense.
then it makes sense.
Right. Why don't you tell the story? We're
Oh, no.
circling around it.
No,
Okay. Fair enough. Go back to Stone.
Maybe a setup for tomorrow. The Gobitis case had already been decided prior
before my time.
before your time. When you become one of the law clerks for Chief Justice Stone, was that a conversation prior to, was it Jones v. was it Opelika?
City of Opelika.
No, we had all of those Jehovah's Witness cases.
Right.
And happily, Stone and I were in total agreement on how they should come out. And again, this goes to the point I made earlier, that Stone and I had a remarkably harmonious relationship. And it was just accidental. There was one case in the 2 years, one important case, where we disagreed. And I tried to convince him I couldn't. It was Betts against Brady. And I did a lot of work on that case. I collected statutes and opinions from a lot of states about how they were treating the right to counsel in cases of impecunious defendants. And I tried my best to convince Stone he ought to change his mind. He didn't. And then I said to him, Black is writing the opinion on the other side of this case. Do you have any objection if I give his law clerk all the stuff I've collected? Stone said, go ahead and do it. So I did. And if you look in Black's opinion, you'll find the stuff I had collected.
So it was much too late for Stone, of course, but for you, Gideon was your day.
Well, I thought sooner or later they'd have to come around to that.
That's very nice.
Did Stone ever permit you to author an opinion?
You mean write one from scratch?
Right.
No. If you mean, did I write isolated sentences, or
Sure.
maybe even half a paragraph in an opinion here or there, sure.
Yeah.
But that's different.
Okay.
No, Stone was quite able to do his own drafts. They needed some help because he wrote sentences that were a little too dramatic. They were very long. They needed some punctuation, shortening, and he liked his law clerks to do that for him.
Right.
He was not unaware of this, but he was not gun shy about writing.
Did you have to deal with his handwriting, or was it the secretary?
A little of each.
Did it take you a while to learn to decipher that?
A little.
Yeah. It's very hard. I'm getting there, but it's very hard.
You didn't want
No,
to-
thanks. Yeah. You know what Douglas said about Stone's handwriting?
Yeah.
That it was like a fly going through ink and then walking across a piece of paper.
But back to the Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah.
The Jones case sort of heralded the change of view of three of the justices.
Yes. They gratuitously stated in that case that they had changed their mind about Gobitis.
Did Stone react to that? Did he come and say,
No,
Bennett, you can't believe this, but?
no.
Yeah. So then, therefore, was there sort of this looking for that test case, which would bring up that subject again?
Well, the court didn't look for the test case. The
Well, no,
test case looked for the court.
Right. But
You know, Judge Parker did what you don't normally do. He said, I now detect that the law is no longer what the court said it was, even though they haven't yet formally overruled the case.
What was Parker's stature as of 42, 43? You know, he was one vote from having been a justice himself.
Yeah,
He was the lion of the Fourth Circuit,
yeah.
3-judge circuit, I think. Was it special coming from Parker?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, everybody thought that Parker was a one of the leading judges in the courts of appeals in the country.
Okay.
But that it would have been the same coming from anybody else.
Right. Was there a view that he'd gotten a bad shake from the Senate?
I don't remember hearing anybody say that.
Okay.
I'm sure there were people who thought that.
Parker.
I'm sure there were other people too.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, just as a lot of people thought Hainsworth got a bad shake.
Right. I mean, sort of, I guess in more modern times I draw a distinction
Hainsworth
between
was
and Carswell.
Hainsworth was as good a judge as you could find.
Right. And nobody thinks
I later
Carswell
got to
a
know him
bad shake.
pretty well because we put him on the council of the American Law Institute
Okay.
after he had been turned down.
Right.
And when I got to know his wife somewhat well, she said to me one day, Bennett, you know, I'm sort of glad we never had to move to Washington.
Barnett is finally argued, and again, I don't want to go too far into it, but you finally have the day where the case is sitting in oral arguments. Did you attend the oral arguments?
I don't remember. I might have, because this fella Hayden
I
Covington
was just going to ask about it.
was the Daniel Webster of our generation. I don't mean that he was that good a lawyer as Daniel Webster, but he had all these cases, and he kept appearing before the court. And
These were Jehovah's Witnesses.
yeah, he was a Jehovah's Witness,
Right.
I believe, just as his predecessor, Judge Rutherford, who had argued one of the earlier cases, maybe two of the earlier cases.
Oh, really?
Judge Rutherford had another distinction. He appeared in what all the law clerks thought was an orange suit.
Tell me about him?
I don't remember much about him,
Yeah. Because clearly he's a
but Hayden Covington was a frequent appearer.
yeah. This has nothing to do with Covington and
No.
Did you get a sense after the arguments that this was sort of a foregone conclusion as far as what the decision would be?
Well, I knew what the vote was
Yeah.
right after the conference.
Right.
And I think I could have guessed what it would be right before the conference.
Mhm.
Do you know what Reed thought about the process of the flag salute cases?
Well, he thought that the court was right the first time.
Okay. Was he tempted to move?
I doubt it.
Okay. What was it? I mean, it obviously happened. Jones 1 to Jones 2, Gobitis to Barnett.
Hmm.
Was there institutional concern about the court making so many turns?
Well, I'm sure that the people who ended up in the minority thought it was an unduly hasty reversal,
Right.
but I think they understood why it was happening.
Okay. What about from Stone's perspective as the chief
Well,
leader of the institution?
I'll tell you, there's a long list of Stone's dissents that became, on constitutional matters, that became law.
Right.
Stone gloried in that list.
Okay.
It pleased him immensely.
Aside from the professional discouragement that Felix Frankfurter had with this switch, probably generally, but certainly within 3 years, did you sense any impact from a personal side between Frankfurter and Stone as a result of this sort of decision?
No. I can't remember at the time, and things didn't begin to go downhill in Stone's chief justiceship till later, after my time,
Mhm.
when there was more wrangling and the conferences got longer and longer.
Can you date that?
No, I just know it was after my time.
Right. But not so long after your time.
Not so long, but enough so I wasn't there.
Okay. Your successor clerk was whom? Or clerks? There were,
Yeah, who was immediately after me? I'd have to look it up, I'm sorry to say.
No, I don't recall that.
If you had to pause and John Barrett, as a biographer of Justice Robert Jackson, he probably asked you the question, but for the tape, that what was your impressions of Robert H. Jackson?
Oh, well, I'm a Jackson enthusiast. John, I think, knows it. I said so in writing, and it wasn't anything I made up last year when I got up that issue in honor of Jackson. I always felt that way.
Anything particular? Any sort of style, mannerisms?
Well, I think having a fine style is a wonderful thing. Not many people have it. As I said earlier, Learned Hand had it, Holmes had it, Cardoza had it, although a little too lurid occasionally.
And you would say Stone did not have it?
No, Stone had a good, solid style, but it wasn't a flair, a literary flair. I'm talking about one that combines thoughts with a little literary flair.
Okay.
Stone had a good style.
Right.
Bennett, is there a judicial legacy of Justice Jackson? We often hear about his writing style, his ability to have command of the King's English, but from a jurisprudence viewpoint, do you think there's a legacy today?
Well, I suppose the Barnett case arguably is part of a legacy. It dealt with something that is going to come up as frequently as long as the Republic stands, namely the considerations on the side of freedom and the considerations on the side of what the state ought to be allowed to impose. And that general problem isn't going to go away. It's a question of where you draw the line. But I suppose the Steele case, seizure case, is part of his legacy. He wrote a separate opinion, and everybody regards it as the law. I don't know what John's going to say about it. How long are you going to be writing this biography, John?
He won't tell you.
A while, but pieces will be emerging. Warner Gardner and Bob Jackson. Obviously,
Yeah.
I got to meet Warner and heard some of it directly, but since he's not here,
Well,
maybe you could speak for him.
well, he spoke himself on numerous occasions. He thought Jackson was about the best lawyer he'd ever dealt with.
For the purposes, John, maybe either John or Bennett, for the tape, what was the relationship between Warner Gardner and where were their paths crossed?
In the SG's office.
Okay.
It's largely.
Mhm.
And Warner started under Reed before Jackson was SG, right?
Yeah.
Reed, Jackson, Biddle, Fay.
Fay,
Right.
period.
Period. Okay. Another Jackson colleague.
As you'll see in this chapter when it comes out, he and Fay didn't really see eye to eye, and he was uncomfortable with Fay, and he said it was a great thing that his partner Frank Shea, who was Fay's closest friend, which was true, and that he and Frank Shea never had any falling out whatsoever.
You're a mind reader. I was just about to ask you about Frank Shea. He was another Jackson colleague. He was a Western New York lawyer,
He had been
law dean.
at Buffalo Law School.
Right. Tell us about him and Jackson as you know it.
I don't know much about it, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, he was a short-termer at Nuremberg, as I recall.
Right.
And whether he had a falling out with Jackson or not, I don't know.
Okay. What was he like, Frank Shea?
Frank Shea, well, he was a connoisseur of wine. He had certain elegant traits. He was very good at picking people to do things. He was an extremely good business getter. He didn't know Warner very much, and he worked on persuading Warner to join him in setting up this law partnership of two people. And he prevailed, and they never had a bad word of any kind. And Warner never wanted to have anything to do with being the administrator in the law firm, and he left that all to Frank, and they were both quite happy about it. And they were very different.
For the purposes of the tape, we talked about Judge Parker earlier, and I believe he's the same Judge Parker who ended up being the alternate judge at Nuremberg.
He was indeed.
Yeah.
Did you get recruited for Nuremberg? Did
No.
you think about going or trying to?
Nobody ever asked me, and I was in a different fix. I had been in the war in something called Special Branch of Military Intelligence in the Army. And at the end of the war, many of my colleagues got onto an expedition to Japan, where I would have loved to go, to check up on how good our intelligence had been during the war. But I was tapped to do something else. You may dimly remember there was something called the Joint Committee investigating the attack on Pearl Harbor. About 4 lawyers from Special Branch became counsel to the War Department in that investigation. And I happened to be one of the 4. And it went on for 5.5 months. I would have been quite happy to have been in Japan instead, but I wasn't. But one of the interesting things about this investigation was that nobody in the War Department ever told us what to do. We exercised our best judgment and we did it. We told people what we did. We were responsible for the appearances of all the top brass of the Army as witnesses. And as I said, nobody ever told us what to do. The Joint Committee wanted a lot of documents that had been ultra top secret documents during the war that were over at Arlington Hall. We decided we would give them to them. The Navy had a similar request, and they refused to give them to the committee. And the chairman of the committee, Alvin Barkley, went to the president and said, "Harry, I need those documents." Harry gave them the documents. The result was that the committee counsel and staff were fully trusting with us, and they hated the Navy guys.
That is good.
What time frame was that committee?
Well, it wasn't long after the war.
Yeah. Again, for the tape, what was the conclusion?
You know,
What was your report?
it wasn't my report, it was the committee's report. I mean, I knew what I thought. I thought that it was incredible that Admiral Short and General Short and Admiral Kimmel had not taken additional steps when on November 26th they got a cable saying this is a war warning. And Justice Roberts, incidentally, was one of the witnesses because he had conducted an investigation for the president right after Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And there was a big lobby for Kimmel trying to say it was all Roosevelt's fault. And I don't think they got very far. But it was a long, drawn-out investigation. I would have had an opportunity to stay on even longer because the second deputy counsel for the committee asked me if I would be willing to help him write the report of the committee. I said, oh, for God's sakes, I'm about to get out of the Army and I don't want to do that. And that'll be another couple of months. And he said, okay.
You then became counsel to the U.S. Atomic
Energy Commission, yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, all my stories about how things came about are simple. One day, a fellow named Ed Huddleston, who had been president of the Harvard Law Review the year ahead of me, and had been a close friend of Felix's, and had been Justice Murphy's first law clerk because he was in the SG's office and Murphy took him along with him. He was in special branch during the war, and he was out part of the time out in Hawaii. And sort of helping set up a system under which we could get this very top secret ultra intelligence to operational people in a place where it might do them some good. In any event, after the war, he went to work for a while in the intelligence part of the State Department. And he called me up one day and asked me to come over. And he said, I'm going to go over to this new Atomic Energy Commission that's being set up. I'm going to be Deputy General Counsel. And he said, I thought you might have some good ideas about who I could talk to about getting lawyers. I said, yeah, I've got one, me. And that's how I went to the Atomic Energy Commission.
There you go, perfect. What was your role there?
Well, it was very interesting. We were operating under a brand new statute. Lots of questions came up to which nobody knew the answer. We had a big discussion. The original general counsel was a very bright lawyer who'd been in the State Department and then been working on the Atchison-Lillienthal report, a fellow named Herbert Marks. And Deputy General Counsel was a fellow named Joseph Volpe, who later became my partner in private practice. We had a big discussion about whether, when something doubtful came up that wasn't clear under the statute, but we thought we ought to do it, whether we should go over to the General Accounting Office in advance and tell them what we were planning to do and see what they thought about it. And Herb Marks was absolutely against this. He said, it's a big mistake. You're going to get the GAO involved in the commission's business in a way that they'll just be obstructionists, and I'm against it. And Joe and I said, look, the GAO had an office at Oak Ridge during the war. They knew about the Manhattan Project, at least 5 or 6 of them did. And we don't think that that's inevitable. We think it's going to be a better assurance to the commission if we go over there and talk to them in advance. Herb said, Joe, if you and Bennett want to do that, go ahead. I'm not going to go with you. So that's what we did. And we went over and we made friends with the general counsel of the General Accounting Office, a guy named G. Lyle Fisher. And time after time, we went over there truly on things that under the statutes, you couldn't tell what the right answer was. And we said, these are the reasons we're going to want to do this. We think the statute justifies it. We know it's not clear as a bell, but we think in the interest of the country it ought to be done, and the commission wants to do it. And he would say, sounds all right to me. He never went back on that. In all the times we went to see him, it stuck. Mm-hmm. And it taught me a lot about how to deal with some branches of the government. We were just absolutely right about it.
Did your paths cross with David Lilienthal's much?
Oh, yeah. He was chairman of the commission, and among other things, during the time he was still chairman, Senator Hickenlooper launched a big congressional hearing for what he called incredible mismanagement. And all the lawyers, of course, worked on that day after day, week after week, month after month. And then after that, when Dave went to New York, and when Joe and I were out in private practice, we did some work for the company Dave sort of set up in New York, Development and Resources Corporation.
You've had an amazing life.
I have one more AEC question. Was Gordon Dean with the commission when you were there?
He was indeed.
Tell us a little bit about Gordon.
Well,
He was a Jackson person.
well, he was, I realize that. He was a protege of Senator McMahon,
Right, he was a Brian
Yes.
McMahon person.
as you probably know.
Yes, I do.
And
Well, Brian McMahon had been the criminal division,
yeah,
and he was a Jackson person too, in
Yeah.
a sense. It was a
Yeah.
small town.
yeah, it was. And, well, Gordon Dean was the chairman for, I guess, almost half the time I was at the commission,
Okay.
which ended at the close of business Friday, April 6, 1951.
Why is that date so vivid?
Because I told him I was resigning.
I see. Okay. Okay.
Sent him a nice little letter saying that's it.
Okay. What was he like? Personality, abilities,
Well,
style?
he was a very cautious person. But
I came in very late, but can I ask a question? Is that
Sure.
legal?
sure,
I'm a scientist. Did you know Robert Patterson? Secretary of Board?
well, he was a circuit judge the year I was learned hand's law clerk.
Okay.
And my friend and classmate John O'Boyle was his law clerk. So sure I know him.
Yeah, okay. What would your comment be on the fact that Roosevelt met Robert Oppenheimer in Patterson's presence, and at that time decided that the United States was going to keep control of nuclear weaponry if it was at all possible? What was your comment on, what would your comment be on Oppenheimer?
Well, I knew Robert moderately well.
Okay.
My partner Joe Volpe knew him extremely well.
Right, yeah.
And actually, when his hearing proceeding came up, he wanted Joe to be his lawyer. And Joe felt that because when Joe had been at the commission, he had reviewed the file for the commission. He had a conflict of interest that should disqualify him from being Robert's lawyer in the hearing. And so Robert got Herb Marks, same Herb Marks, to be his lawyer, but on numerous occasions, Robert would come around and talk to us in our office during the hearing. And it later turned out, and all this has been published, that our office was bugged on those occasions. And that the people who were running the hearing, sometimes the next morning would have a transcript of the conversations in our office. And Joe went to see Bobby Kennedy, who was then Attorney General, because our first instinct was the FBI maybe had done it. And Joe said, this is an outrageous thing. And Kennedy said, I agree with you, I'll look into it. And about a week later, he called up Joe and he said, Joe, I looked into it. The FBI didn't do it. And we were later satisfied he was correct.
Which means the Senate.
No, we know. I think we know who did it. I think we know he did. The guy who did it, who was what I would pleasantly call a creep, did it at the instigation of Louis Strauss. I think that's what we thought.
Okay.
That's not answering your question.
No, it's really evading your question quite well.
But I don't know whether Robert Patterson was present when Roosevelt said that to Robert Oppenheimer.